If we go back a few years, you're looking at the Magnificent Seven were really driving the stock market returns, and they were the stocks that had the strongest earnings growth. And then you start to look at last year and then really into this year, we're seeing this theme really start to expand. The rest of the market is start to have much stronger earnings growth.
Really, none of the Mag 7 has performed all that well this year to date at least. But still, 8 out of the 11 S&P sectors are positive.
You have to start by the chip names and the earnings growth and the gains the stocks themselves have had. SanDisk up 790%, Micron over 300%.
On this episode of Early Bird, what were the big themes, winners, and losers in the stock market during the first half of 2026? Joining us today on the podcast to discuss these topics are John Zetlmaier, founder of Zetlmaier Wealth Management, Will Allen, founder of Sentara Capital, and Tim Thomas, Chief Investment Officer at Badgley Phelps Wealth Managers. If you're an investor looking to stay on top of the latest market trends, then you're listening to the right podcast. This is Early Bird, and I'm your host, Stephen Lerner. Before we get to today's discussion, let me tell you how you can save time and beat the market through Early Bird, a free daily email newsletter featuring commentary about the latest trends in stocks, cryptocurrency, and equity crowdfunding. Early Bird is designed to help individual and non-professional investors stay on top of all of the critical investing trends. The newsletter is 100% free and is sent to your email box each weekday morning. Subscribe to Early Bird for free at www.earlybird.email. Once again, that's earlybird.email. And now, today's discussion. All right, welcome everybody to the Early Bird podcast. The first half of 2026 is done, and what a half it was for the stock market. There were some big winners and losers and many big themes that happened in the stock market in the first half of 2026. So today we have put together a roundtable of experts to break down what happened in the first half and what investors need to know going into the second half of the year. Tim, I'll start with you. I want to talk a bit about some of the big investing themes that we saw in the first half of the year. When you look back at the first half of 2026 in the stock market, what are some of those big investing themes that come to mind?
Well, I'd say first and foremost, I'd say there's broadening earnings growth. So you're seeing, if we go back a few years, you're looking at the Magnificent Seven were really driving the stock market returns, and they were the stocks that had the strongest earnings growth. And then you start to look at last year and then really into this year, we're seeing this theme really start to expand. The rest of the market is start to have much stronger earnings growth. And we've seen that really transpire, again, not only for last year, but that is a strengthening theme as we've gotten into this year. So that's first and foremost. Another one I'd just throw out is this narrative that's really taken over. We've got very strong spending by the hyperscalers, and in prior years, those were the big winners, the big strong performers. And now we're starting to see that if the hyperscalers are going to spend at the magnitude they're going to spend at, then the companies that provide components to them, semiconductors, memory, what have you, they're seeing tremendous demand for their products, and they're able to raise prices. Their profit margins are going up, and their earnings are going up, as well as their stock prices. So I'll leave it at that. But those are two of the biggest themes we saw in the first half.
Yeah, those are two pretty big themes. A lot of investors noticed them, so I'm glad you highlighted them today. John, any particular themes that we may have mentioned or haven't mentioned that stand out for you at the first half of 2026?
Well, two things really. You've got AI, which dominates headlines right now. You also have IPOs, SpaceX, which just came out. You've got Anthropic and OpenAI that are maybe going to come out later this year. We don't know yet. But everybody is really chomping at the bit for those, and that's going to be interesting to see how that unfolds moving forward. kind of from a macro point of view, though, I think this new Fed chair, that could really throw a wrench in the market's gears if he does what he's saying he's going to do. Again, that'll remain to be seen.
Good point. We'll have to keep an eye on interest rates and where they might go in the second half of this year. Thank you. Any other particular themes that investors should look back on for the first half of 2026? Anything else that stand out to you?
Well, I think I want to go back and hit on something. I think it was Tim who mentioned earnings growth. It has been 5 straight quarters where earnings growth in the S&P 500 has come in much higher than where was forecast. On April 1st, first quarter growth was supposed to be 13% for the S&P 500. It ended up at 28.6%. And it was it wasn't just tech. We got 53% growth, consumer discretionary, 41%, comm services, 49%, financials, 21%, and industrials, 21%. When you have earnings growth that broad, it's going to be tough for the stock market not to do well. That's one thing I wanted to mention. I also want to hit on SpaceX because, and I know a guest, John, already mentioned that. I think that was a big story. I've been in the industry 28 years. I have never been asked so many times by clients, friends, family members. Everyone wanted to talk about SpaceX. Everyone wanted a piece of that. And I think it's important to note, if you take a look over the last 20 years or so at many of the big tech IPOs, and many of them are companies that have been great stocks, but in that first year, on average, drawdown of over 55%. We've already seen SpaceX from its peak at 225 drop over 30% just in a few days. It's going to be very volatile name, no doubt, all year long. And you just have to be careful, I think, if you're an investor with some of these big IPOs. They may end up being great stocks down the road, but you have to be cautious at the start.
Yeah, you're right. Good point about what SpaceX meant in the first half of the year. A big IPO, and good point on what retail investors should keep an eye out regarding the next batch of IPOs that come down the pike. We always say to listeners, speak to a financial advisor before making any investing decisions. That goes for anything that we're saying here as well. Looking back at the first half of the year, I want to take a look at some of the big winners right now and ask each of you if there are any particular stocks or sectors that come to mind. Well, that first half of the year, there was some massive stocks that had some incredible growth in the first half of the year. Well, anything in particular come to your mind in that first half?
Well, I think you have to start by the chip names and the earnings growth and the gains the stocks themselves have had. SanDisk up 790%, Micron over 300%, Intel. I did not think we'd see the day when we were talking about Intel. This is a flashback to the late 90s, no doubt, up 246%, Western Digital, Seagate. The chip names have been absolutely on fire. And I get a little concerned if you look at the charts. They do look pretty parabolic to me now, but they have no doubt been great winners. And I think on the opposite side, it's been software, the SaaS names.
Oh, we'll talk about some of the losers in a second. Let's focus on the winners.
Yeah. Sure. Well, I think those have been some winners. I'll mention another winner, though, that wasn't one 3 months ago, and that are two of the cyber names, CrowdStrike and Palo Alto Networks, who were losers midway through. Both have had massive rallies in the last 3 months and have ended the first half up between 60 and 70%. And a lot of times, if you're an investor, it can be easy to get caught up in whatever the narrative at the time was. Mid-year, it was these cyber names were in trouble because of AI. But in reality, that doesn't look like that's the case. And both were really good stocks over the last 3 months, especially.
Yeah, both have really come on in the second quarter of this year, recovered after a slow start to the year. Great point. Well, Tim, any particular sectors that you want to point to as being big winners in the first half of 2026?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'd point to a lot of the same groups and sectors and names for sure. I mean, it's hard to look past semiconductors, memory, basically any of these component providers to the big hyperscalers, if you will. If they're spending hundreds of billions of dollars, then the component providers have to ramp up their production in a sequential fashion, and the reality is they're not doing that, and so you end up with these massive supply shortages, and we're in just a period of dramatic increases in demand, and it's calling into question the cyclicality of these businesses, and particularly in semiconductors and memory, where these are traditionally industries that are pretty cyclical. Some of them go through kind of boom bust periods, and now that's kind of calling into question as to is there a new paradigm for these industries where there's a much stronger and longer demand cycle that really changes that dynamic, and that's how they're being priced. So something to watch for.
Yeah, they have gotten pricier, obviously, after the big run up this year. Great point. John, let's wrap up this point on some of the big winners. Do you have anything to add about what we've seen with the big winners already mentioned, or are there other particular winners in the first half of the year that you might want to spotlight?
Well, I wish I had something else to add, but it really is. I mean, the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index is up 95% year to date, and Micron came out with earnings 2 days ago, yesterday, and
a few days ago.
Yeah, and I mean, they were blowouts, and the forward guidance is incredible. And, there is a supply shortage of these chips and a demand increase. So, I can't believe I'm even saying this, but I still think there's room to run with that trade.
We'll have to see in the second half of this year if that happens, but good point that these were the names, the Microns, Intels, AMDs, SanDisk. They all had incredible run-ups in the first half of the year. We'll see if it continues throughout the year, but a great first half for those stocks and those investors, of course. Let's turn the page and talk a little bit about the stocks and the sectors that did not perform so well in the first half of this year. We sort of touched on it a little bit, but John, I'll have you start this one. Well, what were particular stocks that you thought really lagged behind the market in 2026 in the first half? Anything that comes to your mind?
Yeah, I mean, Microsoft, they're down, 22% right now. You've got Tesla, another big Mag 7 name that's down. Really, none of the Mag 7 has performed all that well this year to date at least. But still, 8 out of the 11 S&P sectors are positive. The only 2 negatives are consumer cyclicals and communications. So, like Tim said earlier, it's really been broad-based earnings growth across the spectrum. And, consumer cyclicals and communications are only down 2.2 and 2.8% respectively. So, not even that bad.
Yeah. Most stocks did very well. There are some stocks that certainly stand out in a negative light, but you're right. Most of those sectors, it was great first half, broad-based growth across the board. It was incredible. We talked a little bit about the losers before. You mentioned some of the software names. Do you want to continue talking about that, or are there other particular stocks that lagged behind in the first half that you want to address?
Yeah, I think most of them are in that software space, and Intuit, Adobe, Trade Desk. It was interesting. I mentioned CrowdStrike went from loser to winner. I think you could see the same thing happen with some of these other names. I think all of software was pretty much taken out and shot earlier in the year. And I think there's still other names in that area, Shopify, Microsoft that was mentioned earlier. They're good companies with a lot of growth, and they've all been lumped together pretty much even still now. And I think it's going to be very interesting in the second half to see which of those names are able to put up strong numbers.
Yeah, we'll have to keep an eye, but you're right. Those software names have just been grouped together, and there seems to be some type of negative vibes going on with all the software names in the first half. It doesn't look so good. Tim, any particular sectors that stand out to you after performing poorly in the first half? We talked about some of the software names, but do you want to talk about those or other names that maybe lagged behind in the first half of the year?
Yeah, I would just echo the comments of the other guests here on the panel. The things I would add to that, though, we also saw weakness in a lot of the tech consulting companies. So another place where AI is viewed to being a major threat to an industry. So that was another space where tech consulting is now being kind of has been a weak performer. Another thing I thought John's point earlier on, if you look at the Magnificent Seven as a group, the performance has been kind of okay, depending on the stock, but that is a major sea change from prior years where they were really driving the performance, and now all of a sudden they're doing okay for the most part, but they're far from the top performers, and in some cases not really performing well at all. So that in particular, I think, is a major shift.
Yeah, it is a big change to see those stocks lag behind. And just going back to the software names, Salesforce, Atlassian, so many of these stocks really struggled in the first half. We'll see what's going to happen in the second half of the year. I do want to wrap up the show, just give you each 30 seconds what you think will happen in the stock market in the second half of the year, either a big theme that we should keep an eye on, or a particular sector that we should watch out for. Just 30 seconds. Tim, I'll have you start. Something to look out for real quick in the second half of the year.
Sure. We expect the earnings to continue to come in strong, and the earnings growth to continue to be well above the long-term average, and we have a positive outlook for the market based on that view. Valuations are a little high, so we do expect that to be a little bit of a headwind, but bottom line is we have a positive outlook and expect strong earnings growth as we go through the remainder of the year.
Fantastic. Thank you. John, 30 seconds. Any particular themes, sectors, stocks, anything that we should be focused on in that second half of 2026 that's coming up?
Well, there's an old axiom that many of you all have heard. The bond market is a lot smarter than the stock market. And I think that what the Federal Reserve's actions are moving forward will really dictate what happens. You have a ton of debt. 33% of U.S. government debt is maturing within the next 12 months with an average interest rate of 3.38%. They're not going to be able to refinance it at that level. And how that impacts things moving forward, it hasn't impacted yet. When does the market take note of this, and what is the ultimate effect? That's what I want to see.
Yeah, that's a great point. The bond market. Keep an eye on that bond market for the second half of the year. It's going to play a big role in all the markets, stock market included. Great point, John. Will, have you wrap us up? About 30 seconds. What are the big themes or stocks or sectors that we should be really focused on in the second half of 2026?
Yeah, I still like the outlook I still think the markets can do well in the back half of the year. I would say watch interest rates. The markets are pricing in rate hikes right now. I'd take the other side of that. We've already seen oil crash down below $70 just in the last week. And then also keep a watch on the economy. There's been a narrative that there's going to be major job loss due to AI. We haven't seen that yet. Initial claims have stayed very, very low. Non-farm payrolls have been very strong the last 3 months. So if the economy hangs in there, if the Fed doesn't hike, I like the market's performance in the second half.
Thank you again to John Zetlmaier, Will Allen, and Tim Thomas for sharing your insights on the stock market in 2026. And thank you to everyone for listening to today's discussion. We'll be back next week for another episode of Early Bird. Have a great day.